Hi, folks. I think this is working. My name is Cathy Hannabach, and I'm the president of Ideas on Fire. And I'm excited that you're here for our webinar about crafting a kick-ass book proposal. There's some feedback on my end, so I'm going to see if I can fix that. Okay, hopefully that should fix it. Haha, better. Okay. So we started this series of free webinars in just this past December, and it's taken off and it's been really exciting. So we've been talking with graduate students, faculty, post-doc, and alt-doc folks about a huge variety of topics, and it's been really fun. So I hope if this is your first webinar, welcome, and I hope you can join us for future ones. And for those of you who have been here from the beginning, thanks for sticking with us. If there's a topic you'd love to see covered in one of these webinars, you can shoot me an email at Cathy@ideasonfire.net, and we can see where we can get that in the webinar schedule. So I'm going to pull up my keynote presentation to see if that will work, and we can get started talking about book proposals. Okay. Slideshow. Okay, so you're in the right place here at the Ideas on Fire webinar. If you're an interdisciplinary scholar or you know someone who is and you're here taking notes for them, that's great too. Welcome. You're also in the right place if you are interested in publishing or just want to learn about the publishing process for academic monographs or edited collections that are published by scholarly presses, either university presses or commercial scholarly presses. I'm not going to talk today about trade publications or publishing with presses that don't go through the peer review process. I'm happy to answer questions about that if you want in the Q&A, but I'm going to be focusing today on scholarly presses. You're also in the right place if you want your book to have a social, political, and/or cultural impact beyond the academy and beyond just getting you tenure. So at Ideas on Fire, we work with authors who are interested in that social, political, and/or cultural impact of their scholarship. And if you got here today, chances are you do too. So what to expect today? You're going to discover how to find the right acquisitions editor for your proposal. You're going to find out when it's okay to submit your project to more than one press at a time, and also when it's not okay. You're going to learn what goes into a book proposal for a scholarly press, so the different elements. You're also going to see what a typical submission and publishing timeline looks like. I'll answer questions, and you'll also hear how you can get more support for your next steps. So let's just jump in. So we're going to start with how to find the right acquisition editor for your particular project. I'm going to assume that you've done at least a little bit of preliminary research on presses that would be a good fit for your project. If you haven't already done that research, that's okay. This webinar will still work for you, but that's the place that you should start. So look around to find the publishers that publish in your specific areas, the areas that your book covers. And then you're going to find the acquisitions editors in charge of the specific lists that those presses publish in. So publishers call lists what you might call categories or subject areas. So we're talking women and gender studies, cultural studies, performance studies, visual culture, anthropology, sociology, religious studies, etc. Those are what publishers call their publishing lists. Individual acquisitions editors are in charge of specific lists. This makes sense based on how scholarly training works, right? You're an expert in a particular set of topics or a specific set of subject areas, and so are acquisitions editors. Acquisitions editors are the ones who you submit your proposal to, and the ones who decide which projects they want to invite to hear more about, and ultimately which projects the press is going to acquire, hence their name, acquisition editors. So once you've found the publishers that would be, or narrowed in on some publishers that would be a good fit for you, you're going to find the acquisition editors that are in charge of the lists that your book fits with. Academic presses have this information conveniently on their website. So you're going to check out the websites of those publishers that you've become curious about, that you might want to send your proposal to. And you're going to identify the individual acquisitions editors that are in charge of the list that your book fits with. Now, if you're here, you're probably an interdisciplinary scholar of some sort, which means your book will probably fit on multiple lists. That's good. That means it potentially has multiple audiences. But you're going to find the acquisition editor in charge of the list that your book most closely fits with, realizing that it also might overlap with some other lists, right? But find the acquisition editor who's the best fit for your project. And you're going to direct your proposal to them. If you get it slightly wrong, if it should really go to this other editor and not the one you originally sent it to, they will forward it. So don't worry about that. You haven't blown your chance at a publishing contract. But show them that you've done the legwork up front to find out who's the best editor to target your project to. A lot of our clients wonder whether it's okay to submit your proposal to more than one press at the same time. It's perfectly okay and indeed expected for you to submit your book proposal to more than one press simultaneously. It's not okay to submit your full manuscript to more than one press simultaneously. There are super rare exceptions to this. Sometimes individual authors are granted a particular permission to have their full manuscript under review at multiple presses at once, but it's extraordinarily rare. Count on the fact that you can't. So what is the difference between these two things? When you're submitting your proposal, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, it's essentially an inquiry. You're saying, here's what my book is about. Here are the different elements that comprise the proposal, which I'll talk about in a minute. Are you, press, interested in hearing more about this and seeing my full manuscript? When you submit your proposal, you do not submit your full manuscript. And I will talk more about this in a minute. But at that stage, you're perfectly welcome to submit your proposal to as many presses as you want. When you hear back from a press that says, this sounds great, we'd love to hear more, please send us your full manuscript when it's completed, and we'll send it out for peer review. At that point, you shouldn't send that full manuscript to multiple presses at the same time. This might mean if you have great a response to your proposal and you have multiple presses clamoring to read that full manuscript, that means being upfront with all of those presses, letting them know which one you're going to send your full manuscript to, and if they are open to multiple full manuscript submissions. If not, then you're going to withdraw your submission from the presses, from the other presses, and you're going to focus on the press that you've said is the best fit for your manuscript. The reason why it's not okay to send your full manuscript to more than one press simultaneously is because the peer review process is a chance for the press to invest a lot of time and actually money in your project, in developing your project and seeing whether your project is something that they are going to publish. Reviewers cost money. For any of you who've done book manuscript reviews for presses, you know how this works. Presses either pay in cash or they pay in books. You can get X dollars worth of books from that press in exchange for doing a book manuscript review for a publisher. That is a monetary investment on their part, and that's one of the reasons why submitting the full manuscript and sending it out for review to multiple presses isn't really fair. Okay, so what goes in the actual proposal itself? Let's start with the preliminary documents. Just a tip right off the bat, follow the press's directions exactly. This seems like kind of a no-brainer, but I just wanted to put it out there as a reminder. Each individual press will say on their website the different elements that they want included in their book proposals. Follow those directions, right? Help yourself out there. If they want 5 documents, send 5 documents. Don't send 4, don't send 6. Don't get clever about recombining things. Just follow the directions in the same way that you would for a job application, a grant application, or anything like that. So these preliminary documents, these are all of the 3 categories on this slide are all separate documents. So we're going to talk about cover letters, CVs, and sample chapters. So let's start off with your cover letter. This is short. Don't think academic job application cover letter that's 2 inching onto 3 pages, single space, teeny tiny font. Also probably something to avoid with job applications as well, but particularly for book proposal cover letters. This should be short, 1 page max. This is just, hi, I'm so-and-so. I work at whatever university or whatever organization, some affiliation that gives them a sense of who you are. A 2 to 3 sentence description of your book. Thank them, give your contact info. Super brief, super to the point, lets them know who you are, that you're submitting your book and its title with its description to them for consideration for publication, and how to get in contact with you if they want to talk with you further. Some presses accept email submissions, some only accept hard copy mailed submissions. Follow those directions. If they do accept email submissions, you need to figure out what goes in the actual email, right? This can be copied and pasted from your cover letter. It should be very brief. If you do copy and paste it from your cover letter, which is perfectly acceptable, again, your intro, hi, I'm so-and-so, here's my book title, I'm submitting this for publication consideration, here's my super brief description, thank you. If you do copy and paste that from your cover letter, make sure you also attach that cover letter as a file attachment to the email. You're also going to include your CV. For monographs or single author books, your CV is what we're talking about. If you're submitting an edited collection for consideration, you should include the CVs of the editors, as well as biographies of all the contributors. And these can be pretty short. These can be a few sentences, a paragraph max for all the contributors. Just a good tip, make sure to clean up your CV before sending. This doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to overhaul your CV or anything like that. Just give it a quick proofread. Make sure you catch any of those embarrassing typos or formatting weirdness in the same way that you would when you're submitting it for anything else. You're also going to include sample chapters. Now, many presses, not all, and you should check with the individual press that you're interested in, but many presses prefer that you send the introduction and a body chapter. Most of them are also perfectly fine accepting 2 body chapters. Now, I know a lot of folks write the introduction last, and I actually encourage clients to do this for a whole host of reasons that I won't get into. If you're curious, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But that means that if you're still in the process of writing your book, of finishing it, you might not have a completed introduction yet, in which case send 2 body chapters. That's perfectly fine. But if you do have a completed introduction, including that with a body chapter gives the press a broader sense, as well as the reviewers, a broader sense of what your book actually covers. 2 tips for how to decide what sample chapters should go in there. Number 1, the chapters you choose should obviously, perhaps obviously, illustrate your book's argument, as well as be clearly related. The purpose of these chapters is to give both the press and the reviewers that they might send this to a sense of what your book covers. So clearly your chapters should indicate what your book's overarching argument is, in addition to the individual chapter arguments. Those things should be tightly interwoven, right? So the representative chapters should do that and give them a sense of how your book is structured. Another tip, as I said earlier, don't send the full manuscript if an editor hasn't requested it. It's rude. I mean, full book manuscripts can be massive, as no doubt you have experienced. We're talking 200 to 400 pages, sometimes even more for fields that have much longer publications. That's a very large file, a very large PDF to receive in an email, and it's a very intimidating envelope to receive in the mail. So don't send the full manuscript until the editor, the acquisitions editor that you've contacted, specifically requests it. Okay, so those are the preliminary things. What goes in the actual proposal document itself? The proposal is usually one single document. And again, check with the individual press that you're interested in, but most presses have this as one single document. You start off with an overview of your book. We're talking about 2 pages. In that, you're going to foreground your main argument. Your main argument for the entire book should be extremely clear, it should be bold, and it should be right up front in your proposal. The proposal is not a place to be clever. It's not a place to weave a lyrical tale. Your writing style might be more lyrical. It might be more creative. It might be less direct. But your book proposal can't really be those things. The proposal should make your main argument, your book's argument, super clear and right up front. The overview in your book proposal should also make the stakes and the relevance of your argument super duper clear. So this has to do with, why does this argument matter? This is that so what question. What's the bigger picture? Why does this matter in the universe question? So why does your argument matter? And then, why does it matter now? What's the timeliness of it? What's the historical relevance of it now? Why should this publisher publish your book? That's the why does this argument matter? And then also, why should this publisher publish your book now, as opposed to 5 years from now, as opposed to 15 years ago? How does your argument about that topic speak in some way to our contemporary moment? Depending on your topic, this might be more obvious than others. But every book, even if it's about a historical period that happened long ago, or an institution that no longer exists, there's a reason why this book should be published about this topic right now. That's what you need to convey to your publisher. And here's a tip. Here are some reasons that are not reasons that a press should publish your book now. Because I need tenure. Because this was my dissertation. Because a small group of scholars fight about this super niche issue, even though it's super fascinating. Because I'm personally interested in this topic. Because I've done a ton of research on this topic and I just want to get something out the door. None of those are reasons a press should publish your book. They're perfectly legitimate reasons for why you want to publish a book or you need to publish a book. But they're not reasons why a publisher should pay money to publish your book. It's your job to figure out why the publisher should publish your book now. What does it help them do in the world? Scholarly presses, just like trade presses, have spent a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of money cultivating specific communities, specific audiences, right? They have mission statements. They have goals in the world. There's a reason they publish this kind of work and not that kind of work, right? Your job is to find the publisher whose goals and values align with the topic of your book, the approach of your book, and explain to them why your book helps them succeed in those goals, right? That's this kind of stakes and relevance issue. You're also going to describe in about 1 to 2 paragraphs, depending on your field, this may be longer or shorter. You're going to describe your archive, your methodology, and your theoretical frameworks. So we're talking about what objects did you study, those things that you're making claims about, that's your archive. How did you study them, your methodology? Did you interview people? Did you dig through the historical archives? Did you look at people's letters? Did you do visual analysis of media text? How did you study those objects? And then what theories did you use to apply that methodology to your archive? And again, depending on your fields, some of these might be larger categories than others, which is perfectly fine. Once you've done your overview of your book, you're going to move on to a section about audience and market. This is often the element that scholars have the most questions about, which makes complete sense because it's not how we're used to thinking of the production of knowledge and the scholarship that we make, right? But it is something that should highly structure your book as well as your book proposal. So your audience and market section should be about 1 to 2 paragraphs. And in that section, you're going to tell your publisher who will buy your book. And how do you know that? Specificity rules here. So I want you to think big, but also realistically about who will buy your book, which groups of people will buy your book. It's possible to get too broad and say things like, all gender studies scholars ever will buy my book, or everyone interested in the specific topic of my book will buy my book. Neither of those things is true. They will not. Many of them might, if it's framed well and it's publicized well, but all of the group of people are not going to buy your book. It's your job in this section to figure out which groups of people would be interested in your particular approach to this topic, your argument about that topic, your methodology regarding that topic, and the ultimate conclusions you come to about that topic, right? Multiple audiences are ideal, but they should be genuine. So if you're just making up audiences to imply that your book will sell to more and more people, an acquisitions editor can see that a mile away, right? Be realistic, but also seriously consider the diverse groups of people who might be interested in your book. And again, specificity rules here. So what specific kinds of students or scholars or activists or artists would be interested in buying your book? Which kinds of courses can the whole book as well as individual chapters be assigned in? You don't need to name existing courses on the books at your university, right? That's a little too specific because hopefully your book has a market beyond just your university. But you should think in terms of what specific kinds of courses can a professor assign the entire book in. Are we talking intro level survey undergrad courses? Maybe intro to media studies, intro to film studies, intro to gender and sexuality studies. Would an individual chapter in your book be useful to assign in graduate level methodology courses or graduate level theory courses in a specific field? Would your whole book or particular chapters in your book be relevant to assign in courses that are kind of mid-level undergrad courses or upper division seminars on a particular topic? This is the kind of specificity that shows the press that your book has concrete audiences that you've actually researched and thought about, rather than just made assumptions about, well, I think these people would buy my book based on nothing, right? Showing them that you've done this kind of research and this kind of thinking indicates that you can be an active participant in getting your book into the audience, into the hands of audiences who actually genuinely want it and who will buy it. Okay. Continuing on in the proposal itself, you're going to have a section on competition, or a perhaps more positive way of thinking of this. This is my preferred way of thinking about this, is your textual kin. This is about 2 to 3 paragraphs. And this is the section where you talk about the existing books that are already published in the world that your book competes with or aligns with. And you're going to think about why your individual audiences, those specific audiences that you thought about in the audience/market section, why would those audiences spend money on your book over their book? Another way to think about this is what is your unique contribution or the gap you fill? This doesn't mean that you're saying that those books are bad, right? If you shouldn't spend this section trashing other books. That's not what this section is for. This is your chance to create the community or indicate the kind of kin, the textual published kin that your book belongs with. And it's also your chance to indicate the gaps in those other contributions. That gap is what your book fills. This section should not be a list. So don't just list out, this book by this author, this book by that author, this book by that author. Think of structuring this as kind of a lit review, a very, very brief literature review, very, very brief and strategic. So it has some similarities with a traditional literature review, but it's also different in other ways. But this is a chance for you to say, you know, there are, for example, there are books that have been recently published about a similar topic that my book addresses, but their approach comes from the methodology of whatever. In contrast, my book comes from this other methodology, and that allows me to show how blah, 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 right? One thing to make sure that you keep in mind in this textual kin or competition section, if you want to think of it in those terms, is to make sure to include books that are published by the press that you're courting. This often slips people's mind. They have this great section on, here are the existing books around this issue, and here's the unique contribution I make. And their argument about the uniqueness of that contribution is fabulous. But none of the books that are similar to your book come from the press that you're sending the proposal to. Don't make this mistake. The reason why you want to include books that are published by the press that you're courting is to show that your book is a natural fit with that publisher's list. This is the primary thing that your acquisitions editor is figuring out, whether your book is a good fit for their press. They're not saying and if they say no, it's not a good fit, they're not saying your book is bad. They're saying they're not the right publisher to publish it. The audiences that they've cultivated aren't the right audiences for your book, or the fields that they publish in don't align with your book, right? So by including books published by the press that you're submitting your proposal to in this section, you're giving your acquisitions editor evidence that, number one, you know what their lists are. You've researched that. There's a reason why you're submitting your proposal to that press because of those lists, and that your book is a natural fit with their existing lists. You're also going to have a section, a brief section, this can be 1 to 2 sentences, super duper short, on the format. This is that kind of nitty-gritty logistics stuff. So what's your full word count, inclusive of notes, appendices, and bibliography? This can be an estimate, that's perfectly fine, but make it a realistic one. You're also going to include the number of illustrations, whether those illustrations are in black and white or color, whether you've secured permissions for all of those illustrations, and if not, what's a concrete plan for you securing permissions with dates for all of those images. So for some of you, this might not be an issue. You might not be including any illustrations or tables or maps or anything like that. But if you are, you need to say that. You need to say that in the format section. You also, in the format section, need to include any unusual formatting. For most of you, this will not be an issue. But if you have any kind of weird formatting things, you need to tell your press up front. So if, for instance, your book needs to be published in a weird size, or if you need to include a fold-out section for like a big map or something, you need to tell them up front. Those things cut into publishing costs. They add significantly to the publishing costs, which doesn't mean that the press would be disinclined to publish it, but it is something that they need to consider when they decide if your book's a good fit. So just let them know up front. You're also going to include a section about timeline, and this can be about 1 to 3 sentences. You're going to explain to them how much of your book is already written, the exact date that you can deliver a full manuscript, and if it's not completed already, a concrete plan for completion. Be specific here and be realistic. You don't need to lie and say the full manuscript is already written if you've only written 3 chapters. Don't do that. Because if your publisher says, great, send us the full manuscript next week, you're screwed, right? You can't write the rest of the book in a week. Be realistic. You don't have a better shot if the full thing's already done, so don't worry about that. And just be honest. I've written 3 chapters. I'm currently revising the 4th, and the 5th chapter will be written by X date, revised by X date, and I can deliver the full manuscript by X date. Make sure that delivery date is something that you can actually meet, and then meet it, right? And then finally, you're going to include chapter descriptions. You're going to describe each of your chapters in one paragraph max, one paragraph each. Sorry, I should make that clear. So chapter 1, you describe in a paragraph, chapter 2, you describe in a paragraph, etc. In that paragraph, you should state very clearly what is that chapter's argument. How does that chapter's argument link with the book's overarching argument? So how does that chapter argument help illustrate or help support the book's overarching argument? What are your archival objects or case studies? What are the objects through which you make that argument in this individual chapter? And then a very brief summary of your conclusions. What do you say about those case studies? What do you say about that argument in that chapter? If you have any appendices, like if you have an appendix about your methodology or about some of your archival objects or about interviews or anything like that, you'll also list and describe them in the chapter description section. Some of you might not have these, in which case you don't need to worry about that. So these are the elements for the proposal itself, right? An overview of the book, a section about audience and market, a section about competition, or as I like to call it, textual kin, which just sounds more supportive, a section on format, a section on timeline, and a section of chapter descriptions. This all is going to be one single document. Book proposals are usually around 10 pages. If yours is a bit shorter than that, that's fine. If it's a bit longer than that, I would see if you could trim it down. But we're not talking a massive document, right? Acquisitions editors get a lot of book proposals, and they like that. They like seeing what great scholarship is being produced. But the more you can help them out in not being inundated with a ginormous document that they're going to have to dig through, the more friendly they're going to be towards your project. Think about how this works, for instance, when you sit on search committees. Do you really want to read a 5-page cover letter? How do you feel about the person who sends you a 5-page cover letter? Not very positive, right? So help yourself out. Follow the directions that the press lists on the elements of the proposal that they require, and do what you can to keep your proposal under 10 pages. I also wanted to talk today about a sample publishing timeline. Now, depending on your field, depending on the press, and depending on the state of your existing manuscript, this timeline can vary dramatically. So this is just a sample, and keep in mind that it might be much shorter or much longer for your individual project, depending on your situation. But just for the sake of an overview, we can go through this. So let's say it's the very end of February. Let's say you are raring to go. You have created a proposal plan, or you're going to start after this webinar because you're super excited to get started. You're going to start writing or revising your proposal, either alone or with support from a professional editor, however you have that organized. You're also, hopefully at this point, if you're at the stage where you're putting together a book proposal, you've also started building your author platform and doing preliminary book marketing elements, even if you haven't thought of them in those terms. For instance, presenting at conferences, getting feedback from peers, revising your ideas based on that. Perhaps you've been blogging or writing op-eds. You've been publishing journal articles on this topic. You've been getting reviews that way, which will help incorporate and shape the ultimate book project. You've been talking about this project on social media. Perhaps you've been doing email marketing. These ways of building your author platform and letting communities know that you're writing a book on this topic, right? So in March 2017, assuming you're going to follow this, and again, this may be longer or shorter depending on your situation, you're going to identify some publishers that would be a good fit for your project. You can either do this yourself or you can get help from an editor. One option, depending on when in the year you're doing this, is to set up meetings at conferences with acquisition editors. And again, if you're doing this at a time of year in which there aren't very many conferences that have book exhibits and thus acquisition editors from the presses you're interested in, this might not be an option for you. But if it is, you might consider setting up meetings with them to talk about your project, to get feedback on your project, to hone your project, and to see if it would be a good fit for their individual press. Next, you're going to submit your proposal to those publishers that you've identified. About 4 to 6 weeks later, depending on the press will let you know, yes, this sounds great. Please send us the full manuscript when it's done. Or, sorry, we're not a great fit, but good luck with the project. I want to reiterate, if they say, sorry, we're not a good fit, that's literally what they mean. They're not saying your book is bad. They're not saying it shouldn't or couldn't be published. They're saying that they cannot do your book justice. They're not the right fit for it. Somebody else could be, right? If they say, yes, please send us the full manuscript when it's done, depending on the state of your manuscript, you might need to do some revisions to finish that, right? If you have a full manuscript already done, like it's ready to go, you can send it off right now, then by all means do that. And you're going to shorten this timeline tremendously. But if it's not, which is perfectly fine, you do not need to have a full manuscript to submit a book proposal. If you still need to write it or edit it, that's what you're going to be doing over the coming months. That may take longer or shorter depending on how much work in that area you have to do. So then you're going to be writing as well as developmentally editing and copy editing that full manuscript, either alone or with help from an editor. And then you're going to send it off, right? If the publishers say, sorry, we're not a good fit, but good luck with the project, at that point, you're going to identify more publishers and you're just going to repeat the process. Books often go through a lot of rounds of book proposals. It's not a bad thing. It's not something to be embarrassed about. It's not something to feel shame about if your book gets rejected from a publisher. Most books get rejected from at least one publisher. It's perfectly fine. It just means that they're not the right fit. So try not to lose hope. I know it can be disheartening. I know it can be frustrating, but try not to lose hope and just do what you can to find the publisher that is a good fit. So once you've worked on writing, finishing, researching, editing, revising, whatever it is you have to do on that full manuscript, eventually, whenever that is, you're going to send it to the press. You submitted your full manuscript to the press, and it's going to be sent out to reviewers for peer review. At that point, you should celebrate, because that's awesome. You just wrote a book, and you sent it off to publishers. You should totally celebrate that. At that point, the press is going to send the manuscript out for peer review. Alternatively, they can do that peer review internally. Different presses organize their editorial boards and their review boards differently. They'll indicate this on their website. Most academic presses send it out for peer review to external reviewers. So these are experts in the fields that your book covers or that your book is situated in, who are going to read your entire book, cover to cover, or page 1 to page whatever, and they're going to write up reader reports based on it. Those peer reviewers are going to recommend that the press either accept it, reject it, or accept it with revisions. The peer reviewers are going to send those reviews to the press. The press is going to review those reviews, and the press is going to decide whether to accept it, reject it, or accept it with revisions, and tell you that. Almost no book ever gets accepted with no revisions whatsoever. I mean, that's just absurd, right? So chances are it will either be accept with revisions or reject. And at that point, they'll tell you their decision. If you get an accept with revisions, you're going to revise that manuscript based on those peer reviews, again, either alone or with an editor. Depending on how extensive that revision is, this can take a month, it can take several months. This is something, a deadline that you will work out with the publisher and with the individual editor that you've been conversing with. Once you've revised the manuscript based on those reviews, you've addressed the things that those reviewers have requested that you address, you're going to return it to the press. The press is going to send that manuscript back to those same reviewers if they're available. If they're not available, they'll send it to new reviewers. Those reviewers say, Great, they addressed all my concerns, they added the things that they needed to add, or they cut the stuff they needed to cut, or they reorganized this, or they inserted a different chapter section or whatever. And then the press is going to decide if they want to ultimately go ahead with publishing it. At that point, they can offer you a book contract. If they say, yes, we want to publish this, this is fantastic, it perfectly aligns with our audiences, it's exactly the kind of thing that our communities are waiting for, they'll give you a book contract, at which point you should celebrate because you just got a book contract. That's awesome. The next thing you're going to do after celebrating is hire an indexer. The reason why you wait until getting a book contract to hire an indexer is because of schedules. So when you get a book contract, your publisher will give you a preliminary timeline for the book's production. It'll be preliminary at that point. They won't know the exact date that your book will be published on or the exact date that you'll receive page proofs, but they will give you a preliminary timeline. And that timeline is what you need to hire an indexer, because an indexer needs to know when they're going to be indexing your book. So at that point, depending on the press's requests, depending on the reviewer's requests, you might need to do some final revisions. You might not, depends on the situation. You complete those final revisions, you submit it back to the press. The press is going to hire usually a freelance copy editor. This is the final manuscript stage to do very, very light copy editing. You're going to approve those press edits and send it back to the press. At this point, if you have a professional website, I recommend adding a book page saying, this is forthcoming by whatever press. You add some information about that. You add some links to the publisher page if it's up already. If not, you can add some images from your book or some preliminary reviews, etc. If you don't have a website or a book somewhere that you can put information about your awesome forthcoming under contract book, this is also a good chance to build one. After you've done all that you can do at the manuscript stage, the manuscript is going to go into production to become a book. This is when the press typesets the book. They create the cover design. There's usually some back and forth where they show you the cover, you give some feedback, you guys figure out what you're going to do. And at this point, they'll probably also send you an author marketing survey. Some presses might send you this earlier, but this is usually the last point at which they will send you that. And that gives you a chance to give them some information about how you are marketing the book, your plans for marketing the book in the future, and some information to help them on figuring out where they can best market the book. After it's been typeset, your cover's been picked, the book has been produced, they're going to send you page proofs. This is that PDF that's actually laid out like the book is going to look. At that point, the indexer that you hired is going to write the index from the page proofs. You're also going to proofread those page proofs yourself, or you're going to hire a professional editor to do so. You're going to send it back to the press, and it's going to go into printing. A few months after that, again, it depends on the schedule of the press, and it depends on their publishing schedule for marketing their books. Your book's going to be published, in which case, celebrate. If you've noticed the repetition of celebrate throughout this, I hope that has come through, because publishing a book is pretty damn awesome and you should celebrate it. And at that point, you're going to start on the post-publication book marketing. So this is everything from book parties to author events, podcast interviews. You're going to be applying for book prizes, seeking out book reviews, participating in author meets critics sessions at conferences, sending your book announcement to listservs, promoting it on social media, getting it in a conference book exhibits, classroom adoption, all of that kind of good stuff, right? So as I said, this timeline might be longer or shorter depending on your situation, depending on the state of your manuscript, and depending on the individual press. But I wanted to give you at least a kind of overview so you get a sense of around about how long this process takes. Okay, so let's, I hope that I've indicated, and I think yes, we have time for questions, awesome. So I hope I've indicated that book publishing is not a solo act. You're working with a lot of other people in the process. You're working with acquisitions editors, you're working with editors, you're working with typesetters, you're working with indexers, you're working with marketers, you're working with a whole bunch of people to get your book into the hands of the people who are already wanting it, right? So if you want support implementing your book proposal plan over the coming months, Ideas on Fire offers a book proposal package where we do some research on publishers to find publishers that would be a good fit for your book. And we also help developmentally edit and copy edit both your book proposal draft itself, as well as the chapters that you're working on to include as part of that proposal. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go to ideasonfire.net/book proposal. You can shoot me an email, Cathy@ideasonfire.net, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. So, are there questions about anything that I've talked about? Let's see. Oh, come back. I'm gonna try to put my video back up. Hang on. There we go. Okay. Questions. So Manuel says, what's the difference in your experience between a book proposal from a dissertation versus a second book? Oh, that's a great question. Right off the bat, second books are less fraught. And that just has to do with experience. That just has to do with you've been through it once and it's less intimidating. Second book proposals tend to be easier to write because you haven't been in the project for as long. And so oftentimes, one of the biggest things that you do when you revise a dissertation into a book is you have to look at the project completely differently than you've looked at it over the course of your graduate school career. And that's possible. Lots of people do it. Fantastic books come out of that process, but it is a process. And when you write your second book, you don't have to do that. When you write your second book, you're writing it as a book to begin with, right? And a lot of people talk about writing their dissertations as a book and thinking about them as a book when they're writing them as dissertations, but that's more of an exercise than it working out in fact. You are writing a dissertation. Dissertations are not books. It's a different genre. You're learning how to write something that could become a book in the future when you're writing a dissertation, right? So I'd say the biggest difference is second book proposals tend to come faster with less kind of fraught baggage attached to them. And because if you've already published a book before, so you've already published book one and now you're writing the proposal for book two, publishers also have a lot more evidence that, number one, you can write a good book and that you know how to match that book with the correct publishers and that you know how to market that book to the audiences and communities that are the best fit for it. Does that answer your question, Manuel? Okay, cool. So Keisha says, I caught the tail end of you saying something about social media. So I was talking about book marketing. So when you are, when you're working on your project at whatever stage, even at the very, very beginning stages of it, hopefully you're talking about that project with people in the world, right? That can be in person, when you meet them at conferences, you let them know what you're working on. It can be your professors if you're a graduate student. It can be your students if you're a faculty member. It can be your clients if you work at an organization. It can be people on social media as well. That's part of how you build an author platform, how you create that stage that lifts you up and shows other people that you know something about this topic, that you're an expert on this topic. And it builds an audience for your book before your book ever comes out. So if people come to know you as that scholar on Twitter who always has really smart things to say about that topic, when your book comes out and you can say, hey, I just published this book about this topic that I've been talking about consistently for X number of years on Twitter, you already know me, those people will want to buy that book. It's a way of building an audience over time. And social media can be a really good way to do that. Another question that folks have, what's an average word count for a chapter? That's going to vary dramatically. It's going to vary by your field, and it's going to vary by the press and the types of projects that they publish. Yeah, I don't even want to make up like an average because it doesn't really exist. It varies dramatically. But if you can think about like a journal article in the humanities and social sciences and the interdisciplinary humanities and social sciences is usually in Microsoft Word pages, usually like 20 to 30 pages. A book chapter in Microsoft Word pages is probably going to be somewhere between 40 and 50-ish, maybe slightly longer. It shouldn't be like 90 pages long. That should definitely be cut into 2 chapters. But also how that Microsoft Word page count translates into typeset page proofs is going to vary dramatically. So, and that's something you can't predict because it has to do with the font that they use, the margin size that they use. Like, you're not dealing with that. You're not dealing with typesetting. You're just dealing with the manuscript pages. So I would, if I had to, I would say anywhere between like 40 and 50, maybe 55 pages per chapter-ish. But take that with a grain of salt and check out other books that are published in your field for a more specific answer to that. Sarah says, I came in late, so sorry if you covered this earlier, but do you need to let publishers know that you're sending the proposal to other presses? And if you hear, okay. Yes, I did talk about this. So you're perfectly, you know, it's perfectly fine to send your proposal to as many presses as you want. You don't need to tell them that you're doing that. They assume that you're doing that. The proposal, remember, is that document that includes like the overview, the market, the competition, textual kin, all format, all that kind of stuff, with your cover letter and your CV and your sample chapters. That package you can send to as many publishers as you want, and you don't need to let them know that. If a press says, this sounds awesome, we read your proposal, we'd love to see the full manuscript, when can you send it to us and we'll send it out for review? At that point, your book should only be under review by one press at the same time. No, one press at once, if that makes sense. And the reason for that I talked about is that peer reviewers are paid. And so they're not paid very much. So don't, you know, if you're trying to build a career being a book peer reviewer, you're not going to be making very much money. It's, you know, it's like $100 or $200. It's a very small amount of money. But the point is, it's money. And so at that point, the press has literally invested money in your project. They haven't given you a contract yet. It's not a guarantee that they will, but they've literally invested money in your project, which is why they're less keen on investing money in your project if they know that other people are doing it too. So at that point, you should withdraw it from the other presses, let it go under peer review with one press. And then if they say, sorry, it's not a great fit after that peer review, then you could go back to those other presses and say, I'd like to go forward if you're still interested, or send it to brand new presses. If you hear from some presses before others, is it okay to ask them to wait till you hear back from other presses? Yeah. Presses assume that you're submitting your project to multiple presses. They know each other, they're friends, they talk to each other. They're both individually, like acquisitions editors hang out with each other, they know who each other are, and the institutions themselves interact with each other. So it's not, this is not a, you know, like super cutthroat industry the way that, like, I don't know, the stock market or something is. They know each other, they like each other. They'll refer you to each other. If they're not a good fit, if they don't publish in your area, they'll say, oh, check out this other university press, they're a much better fit, something like that. So they do have friendly relationships. And it's totally okay to be honest with them and say, I just heard that, you know, the University of Minnesota Press wants to see my full manuscript and send it out for peer review. Duke University Press, would you be interested in, or would it be okay with you if we did a simultaneous peer review process with you? Either one of them might say no, which is perfectly fine. But just be honest with them, and that's totally tactful and expected and fine. Yeah. Are there other questions about the book proposal process? No? Okay. Well, if questions pop up for you later, if you're like, oh, I remember, I wish I had asked her, you can just shoot me an email, Cathy@ideasonfire.net, and let me know. And as I said, you can also check out our book proposal package, on our website, ideasonfire.net, and see the work that we do with editing and indexing clients as well. So thanks so much for being here and talking with me about book proposals. It's one of my favorite genres. It's a weird genre. It's a confusing genre when you first get a hold of it, but it's actually really fun because it lets you think about your project in a completely new way, and it lets you see how publishers look at your project, which is probably differently than you've been looking at it as an author. So it's kind of fun. Our next webinar is March 8th, which is International Women's Day, and it's also the day of the Women's General Strike. And we went back and forth on whether we're going to keep the webinar on the same day or change it to support the strike. But we actually decided to keep it as a way to support the strike. So the topic of the webinar is public pedagogy. And one of our Rockstar coaches, who's a coach in our graduate school Rockstar program and dissertation Rockstar bootcamp, Kate Drabinsky, is going to be leading that workshop. And this is her jam. This is her area of expertise. She loves this stuff. And she wants to use the webinar as a kind of teach-in. So as a way to talk about what does it mean to do public intellectual work, to do public pedagogy in today's political and cultural climate, and why is it even more necessary than ever? What are the pleasures of it? What are the perils of it, or the difficulties of it? And why is it really important? And what are different ways that we can enact that? So that's March 8th. You can register for that. It's free. It's on our website, ideasonfire.net/webinars is the actual page. And I hope to see some of you there. So thanks so much. In about an hour or so, an hour and a half, you'll get an email with a link to the replay of this. You'll also get a link to the slides that I showed, so you'll get a PDF of the slides. And a big thank you for attending. Have a great rest of the day, and hopefully I'll see you on March 8th. Bye.